So we are picking up Pirkei Avos, chapter 4, and we're starting from Mishna Daled, and Mishna 4, chapter 4, Mishna 4, and actually starting with Mishna 5 is where things start to get off, because on Sefaria, these two are one Mishnah, and in the Midrash Shmuel, they're separated into two Mishnahs, so this is where we start to get the numbers off. But Mishnah 4, I think in all versions is Mishnah 4. So at least the first half. Okay, so it says like this. Rabbi Levitas Ish Yavna Omer. Rabbi Levitas, a name that actually I don't think I've seen anywhere else. He was from Yavna apparently, and he says, Me'od me'od have a shval ruach. A person should be me'od me'od, very, very shval ruach. They just translate there as humble spirit, low of spirit. And clearly it's something stressed here, me'od me'od. And why? Shetikvas enosh rima. For the end of man is the worm. That's how they translate it on Sefaria. The word tikva is usually translated as the hope, likavot, is to hope for. The song, hatikva is the hope. So here they say the end, which is probably a fair translation too, but most commentaries understand it to mean the hope, and they therefore wonder, why is that one's hope? Why does it mean that the hope of man is the worm? The basic understanding of the Mishnah is be very humble, and a way to maybe to bring about that humility is recognizing that we are here just temporarily, and a person might think they're so great, right? But just remember, it's just a matter of time where that person will end up in the grave being consumed by worms and maggots. So, which is reminiscent of another Mishnah, which some of the commentaries actually reference, which we'll mention soon. So the Midrash Shmuel quotes from Rav Moshe Al-Mushnino, the question we just mentioned, that what does this mean that it is one's hope that the word that they use as a Hebrew translation is misaveh, to desire. Why would one desire that they end up in the grave consumed by worms? It should have just said a simple word, the sof, the end of man. So thank you, Robert. The article translation, anticipated end, but as the commentaries are pointing out, so just say it more clearly. Just say the sof, the end of a person is worms. So he quotes an answer, and then he doesn't like it so much. So the first answer he quotes is, and by he I mean Rav Moshe Al-Mushnino, who's being quoted by the Midrash Shmuel. He says that he's quoting the Chachmei HaKabbalah, the Kabbalists, although it's not that Kabbalistic of an idea, but we know that the ultimate good for a person is in the afterlife, and that's where a person's soul will cleave to God, again, depending on what they accomplished in this world, to different degrees, but that can only be attained after death, and after a person leaves this world, they're really just getting started in the next world, and so in a certain sense, that is a person's hope is to move on to the next world. So that's what he suggests. It means tikvas enosh rima is that really our hope is for the next world is once we're in the grave. That's what we're looking forward to, and he doesn't really explain how that connects back to the first line. Why is that therefore that a person should be very humble? But again, I guess it speaks of the temporal nature of a person. This world is only temporary, and what's really counts is the next world, and therefore person should maintain their humility. But he doesn't like that explanation so much, because at the end of the day, we're not hoping for the worms. First of all, we're hoping maybe for the afterlife, but not for the worms that consume the flesh. And furthermore, even if we understand and we anticipate the world to come, but we also understand that we need to use every moment of life, and every life is invaluable, is priceless, and there's so much that can be accomplished in this world and needs to be accomplished before one moves on. So we're not hoping for that time. We're hoping to spend as much time in this world and yes, in preparation for the next world, but we don't hope for that moment of departure, of death. So therefore, he suggests a completely different alternative reading of this Mishnah, and that is as follows. He says the word enosh, which is being used to mean man here, is not the typical word for man. The typical word would be Adam, tikvas Adam rima. The hope for mankind is rima, is worms. Why does it choose the word enosh? And he says that the word enosh to describe man connotes a person who's not in their ideal state, an Adam or an Ish. Those are words for a man who's achieved what you call shleimus, perfection, or is at least on the right path. But enosh is somebody who it's kind of a derogatory form to describe man, and it's someone who is very, very earthly and looking and really stooped in the material and physical pleasures of this world, and he says those are things that shorten a person's life. The more they're involved in fulfilling their desires in this world, and so the person who's an enosh, who's more involved in the mundane and in the physical pleasures of this world, they're really, what are they looking forward to? They're really looking forward to just they're eating and they're becoming fleshy, and they're what's going to happen to them? They're just going to end up being consumed in the grave, and maybe they're even helping themselves get there by not living in a healthy way and just fulfilling all their physical desires. So therefore, the Mishnah is actually speaking to two different people in a sense. It's speaking to one person, but referencing the other type. It's saying a person should be very me'od hevish v'aruch. A person should be very humble, and humility he's associating with kind of stepping back from the physical pleasures of this world, and not letting one's desires for honor and pleasure overcome them. Remain humble, and why? Because the hope of a person who doesn't do that is just rima. Is just the hope of an enosh, of a person who's just throwing themselves at the physical pleasures of the world. Their only hope is to be consumed by worms. So don't be that guy, is basically what it's saying. Be very humble. Don't engage in physical pleasures. Don't overly engage. Don't become stooped in physical pleasures and chasing after honor and all of that, because that A, shortens a person's life, and B, it makes a person corpulent and fleshy, and there's more for the worms to get at. That's who we are not to be. Rather be shval ruach, be somebody who's humble, be someone who can hold back from the physical pleasures of this world. That is how Rav Moshe al-Mushnino explains the Mishnah. The Midrash Shmuel offers another approach, and that is that there's a concept that one of the reasons why it's so important for a body to be buried rather than other forms of ridding ourselves of the body is because through the process of burial, so the deterioration of the flesh is actually part of the tikkun, part of the reparation of the person, and and only once the flesh has completely deteriorated, so that's when really the neshama can reach its true resting point of rest. That's what he says the sages teach us. And so and therefore, so that's perhaps why what he means that it's the hope of a person. Not that we hope that happens soon, but we hope that in the end our flesh should be able to deteriorate, and then the soul can reach its desired point of rest. It's again, these are concepts I don't know too much about, and it's interesting because we have on the flip side, we have that like tzaddikim, the righteous, their flesh doesn't rot. There are sources in Chazal, and he actually brings another like an opposite reading of the Mishnah that references that. So I don't know how to reconcile those two. Is it good for the flesh to deteriorate, or the righteous maybe they don't need that, but others need it. But that's a suggestion. What it means, tikvas and oshrima, the hope of a person is worms, is that's when the soul really reaches it can really achieve its rest in the world to come, is only after the deterioration of the flesh. Now, the Mishnah warns us, me'od havish ruach, be very, very humble. And what's this double language? He suggests perhaps this is referencing back to an earlier, very similar Mishnah that said that a person has to remember, in order to avoid sin, a person has to remember three things really, but two that we'll mention now. One is where they come from. They come from a putrid drop of semen, and where they're going, the Mishnah says they're going to end up buried with worms and maggots. This was an earlier Mishnah, and so this Mishnah is kind of reiterating that, and that's a reason to be humble. Remember, we come from nothing. We're going to be nothing. Person should maintain their humility. And then it chooses, though, to remind us about the second point, that our end is just going to be worms, because that's something that's ahead of us still. That which is behind us, a person might say, what happened in the past, maybe I came from nothing, but look who I am now, right? And look who I became. But if they remind themselves where they're going, so then that can help a person maintain their humility. Now, it's possible also that this Mishnah is connected to the previous Mishnah. The last Mishnah we learned, Ben Azai taught, it's that al tehi vaz l'chol adam, don't disgrace any person. And perhaps Rabbi Levitas is saying, don't disgrace anyone except for one person. There's one person who it's okay to disgrace, and that's oneself. Now, again, we have to understand that in the right context. We don't mean that, first of all, a person has to have self-esteem. They can't accomplish anything if they don't have self-esteem. So it's this balance of self-esteem and humility. But what he means, as really he explains with the mashal, is with an analogy, is that when we say don't disgrace anyone, I mean don't look down on people. Sometimes we have to not look down on ourselves, but look up on other people. And that's really what he means. He says that, there's a story of a certain righteous, pious individual who was able to honor everyone. Anybody that he met, he was able to treat them with proper honor. And they asked him, how does he do that? How can he treat people with such respect? And he answered that I've never met somebody who doesn't have something better than me. Everybody has something that's greater than me, and I can respect them for that. So it could be somebody is wiser than me. It could be someone has better character traits, behavior. Could be somebody has physical traits that are better, I can respect them for. Or they don't have something that I have, like they don't have money and yet they do such and such, or they do have money and yet they do such and such. They overcome the challenge or the temptations that money might bring. Somebody is very healthy, so Like, look how well they take care of their health. Somebody is sick, and even though they're sick, they still do such and such. So, or somebody is rich or healthy or whatever it is, it must be that God looks well upon them. It must be they have something good that God's treating them well for. And he was able to look at everybody and find something that, like, oh, look, they're even better than me at this or at that, and that allowed him to respect every person. So to connect this to the previous Mishnah, it's telling us to be humble. That even though we said don't look down on anyone, but sometimes to maintain humility, we have to, I don't know if look down on ourselves. I don't know if we would really recommend that, but at least look up on other people. Look for reasons why we should respect others, and that will help us maintain our own humility as well. Finally, we'll mention one more idea that he quotes from the Chassid Yavitz, and that is similar to the first point, that there might be something about the word enosh here that needs to be brought out, and really the first point we mentioned, the way the Mishnah is speaking here, the way Rabbi Levitas is speaking, is he's first speaking to a second person. He's talking to us. He's saying me'od havish ruach. Be very humble. He doesn't say because your end is worms. He talks about, now he switches to third person, because the end of man is worms. So what's that switch? So our first explanation really dealt with this, where we said that it's saying be very humble and don't engage in hold back from our physical desires of our honor and food and all that, because the end of a person who's an enosh, who just chases after those things, is rima, is just worms. That's not the end that we hope for. So remain humble. That was the first explanation he brought. The Chassid Yavitz says something similar in terms of working with the words that way, but actually a very different concept. He says that if somebody says something that is insulting to us, so we're tempted to lash back out at them and despise them for it, or say something back that's not nice, but we have a concept that many times, again, sometimes we do have to say something, but many times the best thing is to hold our tongue, and that's what we call shomei acher paso ve'eno meshiv, ena meshivin, that somebody is insulting and they don't say anything back. And it takes a certain amount of humility, and it really takes a certain amount of self-esteem, and that's, I think, what he's bringing out. And I think he's reading it as follows. If a person insults you, so one second. Yeah, I think it means, remain low of spirit and don't respond. Be very low of spirit and don't respond. Why? Because what is this person who insulted you? What's the big deal? Tikvas enosh rima. The end of a person is worms. Like, why are we worrying about what somebody else said about us? Does it really? What is that person anyways? They're just a person who's going to end up in the grave as well. So consumed by worms. Like, should it really ruin our day because somebody said something? Is it really worth it for us to lower ourselves and say something back because somebody said something to us? No, just let it slide. Again, if it's somebody being abusive and it's necessary to do something about it, that's one thing. But if somebody just says something to us, it's often not worth it to respond. And one can remind themselves that they are that person is just tikvas enosh rima. The end of an enosh, again, that kind of degrading word of an enosh, of a person who acts in a lowly manner, is just going to be rima anyway. It's just going to be worms in the end. So we shouldn't let it bother us, and we certainly shouldn't let it lower our behavior and get us to responding by ourselves now stooping to a low level of behavior. And this explanation, actually, he says, it's very clear from a verse in Yeshaya, in Isaiah, in chapter 51, verse 7 and 8. In Yeshaya, the verse says kind of exactly this. It says, the Navi, the prophet there says, Shimu Elai Rodfei Tzedek, listen to me, those who chase justice. Im Torasi belibam, if my Torah is in your hearts, al tiru cherpas enosh. Don't be afraid of the insults of enosh, of man, the same word that our Mishnah uses. Umigidufosam al tefasam. And again, don't be afraid, don't be shaken by their insulting words. Ki kebeged yochlam ash, because they will end up being eaten like a garment by a moth. In the end, they're going to be consumed just like a garment gets consumed by a moth. They're also going to be ukitsemer yochlam sas, and also like wool gets eaten by a worm or a moth. So literally, the pasuk, the verse there seems to be saying this idea, and it uses that word enosh, that same word for man, and so the Chassid Yavit suggests that really this Tana, this Mishnah, is coming off of that verse in Yeshaya. And if he is, then it's very clear that this is the correct interpretation. That that don't be afraid, don't be worked up, don't be affected by the insulting words of Enosh, of people, of low people, because their end is like just like a garment will be consumed by a moth, so too the person will end up just being eaten by worms. So really, is it like it's not such a big deal it shouldn't hurt us too much. We shouldn't allow it to hurt us. Okay, so just to quickly summarize what we said about this Mishnah. First he brought from Ramosha Moshnino an idea that he rejected, that it's saying that the hope of man is really, we just hope for the afterlife anyway. So that's what we look forward to, and therefore just be humble in this world and look forward to the afterlife. And he didn't like that so much because as much as we hope for the afterlife, we also hope for as much time in this world to prepare for that, and we also don't hope for the worms. We just hope for the afterlife. So it doesn't fit the word so well. So he ended up saying that it means a person should be very humble and not engage in the physical pleasures of this world and not chase after honor, and because the hope of an enosh, of a low person, is rima, such a person who is involved, who stoops and just engages in just physical pleasures in this world. All they're doing is hurrying their demise and increasing the amount of flesh that's there to be consumed by the worms. So don't be like that. That was one approach. He also suggested that it has to do with the Mishnah that says, remember where you came from, a putrid drop, and where you're going, to the grave. And that's the me'od, reminding us twice to be very humble, to remember both of those things, and but stressing that which lies ahead, because you might say, where I came from, yeah, but look what I became. I'm so great now, right? So I don't have to be humble, but look where we're going. That can again remind us to be humble. The third approach was that a person should remain, even though in the last Mishnah we said don't scorn anyone, but don't bring anyone down. but sometimes to maintain humility, we at least have to put other people ahead of us, to remember that, to look for something that's greater in another person than us, and that could keep us humble. And finally, this idea from the Chassid Yavetz that remain humble and don't be so shaken by the words of other people, insulting words, because they ultimately they are just going to end up being consumed by worms. Are we really so worried about what such a person says? And he brings a proof for that from the verse in Yeshaya, in Isaiah. Okay, Mishnah 5, Mishnah Hey. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka Omer. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka says, Kol hamechalel shem shamayim baseser, anyone who desecrates God's name in private, nifrayin mimenu bagoloi, is punished in the open. Echad shogeg ve'echad mezid b'chilul Hashem. And it doesn't make a difference if the person sinned b'shogeg, accidentally, or if they sinned on purpose. When it comes to chilul Hashem, when it comes to the desecration of God's name, it doesn't make a difference. So when we think of chilul Hashem, desecrating God's name, we usually think of something that's done in public, right? A person does something unbecoming out in the public, whether in front of other Jews or in front of non-Jews. So they're making a chilul Hashem. They're desecrating God's name, because look how a Jew acts. But this Mishnah tells us actually there's a concept of mechal shem shamayim baseser, of desecrating God's name in private and secret without anyone seeing. So what does that mean? How does one desecrate God's name in private? So Rabbeinu Yonah has two suggestions, or at least two examples. He says one is idolatry. Idolatry is desecration of God's name, whether it's done in public or whether it's done in private. It's certainly a greater desecration if it's done in public, but the very act of giving credence to any sort of idol or other god is desecrating God's name. Furthermore, one can desecrate God's name if they take God's name in vain, or they take an oath with God's name that's not true, or a needless oath, or so that also is a desecration of God's name. That's actually a verse. It says, don't swear by my name falsely, and that will be a desecration of God's name, profaning or desecrating God's name. So those are just some examples of how one might desecrate God's name in private. Another suggestion that he brings from Rabbeinu Ephraim is that there are acts that, had it been done in public, it would cause a desecration of God's name. Even such an act, a person shouldn't do in private. So it means any act that, if done in public, would desecrate God's name. So that same act in private is that's what the Mishnah is talking about. If you what does it mean you desecrate God's name in private? It means you do something that, had you done it in public, it would desecrate God's name publicly. Such an act in private is, as the Mishnah goes on to say, is punished in the public eye. Now, what is this Mishnah at all connected to the previous Mishnah? So, or the previous half of the Mishnah, depending on how you break it up. So the Midrash Shmuel quotes from the Ritva, and he says that what it's telling you is, yes, humility is very important, but there's a limitation on that. That's only if it's not a desecration of God's name. But if it's a desecration of God's name, for example, there's somebody is let's say a Torah scholar, and he's being insulted, and it's really not just an insult to the Torah scholar; it's really an insult to Torah. So as a person, it's good to be humble, but sometimes we have to stand up for, not just for ourselves, but for for the defense and the protection of the Torah's honor. So in that case, he's telling you that don't just be humble and let it slip, but rather one has to stand up for the Torah's honor. And if not, that could be a desecration of God's name. That's one possible connection. Another possibility that he quotes from the Abarbanel is that while it's telling you that you should be very humble, but it has to be real humility. And if a person is just faking it, they want to make themselves look humble. It's a fabrication. So, and they're intentionally, trying to deceive people. So then that's a chil Hashem. That's a desecration of God's name. It's a falsification of their character. Again, if the person's working on themselves, but if they're then that's one thing. But if they're just trying to make themselves appear a certain way for their own benefit or their own honor, right? I'm the humblest. You should respect me, right? So then that itself is a desecration of God's name. So, okay, so those are just some possibilities of what we're talking about. What is a mechalel shem shemayim b'seser? What is someone who's desecrating God's name in private? Either it's idolatry, or it's desecrating God's name through a false oath. It's not standing up for the defense of Torah when and being humble when one shouldn't be humble. Rather, they should defend the honor of Torah, or it's somebody who is misrepresenting themselves and trying to deceive people and appearing humble when really they're not there yet. So those are some examples. Now, what does it say about such a person? It says, first of all, nifra'im mimenu b'galoi. The punishment is public. So the sin is private, but the punishment is in public. And secondly, it says, it doesn't matter if you're shogeg or mazing. It doesn't matter if it was accidental, what you did, or deliberate. When it comes to chilul Hashem, when it comes to desecrating God's name, it shouldn't make a difference. So first of all, how can we say that doesn't make a difference? Doing something on purpose, purposely desecrating God's name, should certainly be much worse than unintentionally desecrating God's name. Why would we? It almost sounds like this Mishnah is equating them. Why would we equate them? And furthermore, why does he have to repeat the word at the end, B'chil Hashem? We know what we're talking about. We're talking about somebody who desecrates God's name in private, gets punished in public, whether they're by accident or whether on purpose. It really could stop there. Why does the Mishnah have at the end, B'chil Hashem, when we're talking about desecrating God's name? That seems to be superfluous. So these are two questions that the commentaries deal with. And the Rambam, Maimonides, in his commentary to the Mishnah, he says that it's not saying that the punishment of somebody who does it on purpose is equal to one who does it in private. One who does it by accident. That on purpose is not equal to by accident, but rather it's equating them in terms of that both of them get punished in public. So when it says whether it's on purpose, whether it's by accident, it's going back on the previous clause that they'll be punished in public. It doesn't matter if it was done on purpose or if it was done by accident. The punishment will be public. Now, he doesn't really explain why, but the later commentaries elaborate on this. So Midrash Shmuel quotes again from Rav Moshe al Mushnino, who says that it's certainly like the Rambam understood. It doesn't mean that they are equal in their punishment. It means they're equal in that both of them are punished in public, and he says that makes sense here because if we look at it from the perspective from God's perspective, there's no desecration of God's name in private. It's all galoitim. It's all revealed. It's all public before God. So, so I think what he means is when we're dealing with a sin that relates to desecrating God's name, so it's a sin, directly against God. So then, since from God's perspective, there's no there's everything is revealed. It's all public before God. So therefore, the punishment will be in public, and and even when we say in private, it could be understood in the ways that we describe the sins that we mentioned as examples. Could also be inside a person's heart, right? If a person is sinning in private, meaning in their heart, they are building up heretical beliefs in their hearts, in their minds. That could be a sin in private, and God is fully aware of it. It's public to Him, and so when God brings a punishment for those acts, it's done in public, as opposed to a person who sins against their fellow. So then if it's so then there's a difference between something done in private and something done in public, and but specifically when it comes to Chil Hashem, desecrating God's name, then we want to kind of bring out this idea that before God, you're desecrating God's name. Even if you're doing it in private, before God, it's considered public, and therefore the punishment is in public. And that's why it repeats the words B'chil Hashem, because it's something specific to this. At the end of the Mishnah, it says whether it's on purpose, whether it's by accident, whether it's on purpose, it doesn't matter in terms of that the punishment will be in public, because we're dealing with Chil Hashem, we're dealing with desecrating God's name, and before God, it's all out in the open, it's all public, and therefore the punishment is in public. Now, that's one approach. One approach in the commentaries is that when it says whether on purpose, whether by accident, they're not equal in terms of the level of punishment. They're equal in that they're both going to be punished in public. Other commentaries, though, say no. It's saying that they're equal even in the level of punishment. Now, why should that be? Why? How could we compare something done on purpose to something done by accident, b'shogeg? So the answer is that there's different types of shogeg. There's different types of doing something by accident. So, for example, when it comes to Shabbos, so when it comes to violating Shabbos, so one type of shogeg is, I know that it's Shabbos, I just don't know that this is not allowed on Shabbos. Another type of shogeg is, I didn't realize it was Shabbos. So I did something, I knew I'm not allowed to do this on Shabbos, I just didn't realize that it's Shabbos. So the Abarbanel says that when it comes to desecrating of God's name, one of those is a fair claim, and one of those is not a fair claim. If the shogeg is that I knew I can't desecrate God's name, I just didn't realize that this is considered a desecration of God's name, so that's a fair claim. The person made a mistake, they didn't realize this was something wrong, and so we can't say that such a shogeg, such an accidental act, is equivalent to having done something on purpose. But if somebody tries to say, just like, I didn't know that there's something that you're not allowed to desecrate God's name, so he says that's a ridiculous claim. So even if it's true, it was shogeg. A person didn't realize that they're not allowed to desecrate God's name. But if they don't realize that, then they're completely denying, God and not recognizing what God is, and it's such a fundamental principle that should be forbidden. Such an error is equivalent to having done an act on purpose, and it's such an act of it's on such a level that like such a level of dismissal of God's honor to say I didn't realize that I'm not supposed to desecrate His name. That's the equivalent of having sinned on purpose, and so The Barbanel says that's what we're talking about here when we say whether it's by accident, whether it's on purpose. What we mean by accident, by shogeg, is somebody who didn't realize they shouldn't be desecrating God's name. So that's totally ridiculous, and that's viewed in an equivalent manner to somebody who does it on purpose. Now, just to close out with a couple other ideas. Another idea here, another explanation perhaps why it should be equally bad to do something why actually this is in terms of desecrating God's name in private versus in public. So we might say, well, public is much worse, right? Because you're desecrating God's name in public. But there is an aspect of it that's worse to be done in private. And we find this when we compare different types of stealing, that in some ways, stealing secretly is worse than stealing publicly. Both bad, obviously, but stealing secretly is kind of a statement that I only care about people watching me. I don't care that God's watching me. That's why I won't steal in public. I'll only steal in secret. So similarly, desecrating God's name in public, at least like I equate my respect for people to the respect of God. I don't care about either one, but at least they're equal. But to desecrate God's name in private, I'll only desecrate his name when nobody's looking. So that, in a certain sense, has its own specific negative quality that's worse than doing in public, and that's why the punishment is in public, meaning on an equal level to somebody who desecrates God's name in public. Okay, I think we'll end off with that. So so we end off with a kind of a bit of a harsher Mishnah. Talks about persons the punishments for desecration of God's name, but it serves as a good reminder that we should be mindful of the way that the same way we're mindful of the way we act in public, we need to be mindful of the way that we act in private when we're alone. Okay.